Hello, everybody. Tonight we're going to be working on Unit 6, and I just want to begin by giving you a little bit of a preview of what we're doing in this unit. The first thing that we should be looking at in terms of readings is make sure you read Chapter 5 in your main textbook. You can see the topic there is forms and HTML helpers, so they're kind of combining a couple of topics. Now, we've already did a little bit of work with helpers on a kind of a superficial level. But what you're going to find out is the chapter provides a lot better information than the tutorial document in terms of the depth of content. As a result of that, I'm expecting you guys can read that on your own without me lecturing you on it. If I thought that it was so critical that you might miss some concepts, I would lecture on it, but I think it's pretty understandable. So as a result of that, I will have just a real brief little assignment in this unit, which is a reflection on Chapter 5. So I want you to read the chapter, try to understand it, and then basically compose a document telling me about what you've learned in summary. Okay, reflect on what you've learned. The other part of this unit is we're going to be working on those tutorials some more, and we're going to be working on sections 14 and 15. Hopefully we can get through both of those tonight. That's our goal at least. Whether or not we'll get there, we'll see. But we will certainly try. All right. Let's go ahead and bring the document up onto the screen here. And you can see that we're kind of continuing our work with models. And at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to work on this way of like basically binding our data to a model directly. So the way to kind of think about this, we're working with kind of like a combination of technologies here. So we're working with databases, we're working with C# code, we're working with HTML code. We have all these special little tools that are built into C# and ASP.NET, where you use little square brackets to do short code. And aside from all the HTML in the mix, we also have the Razor syntax in there. And I know it's a lot to learn, right? And the reality is this, that most of this stuff, and I want you guys to hear this and understand this really clearly. If you are a professional programmer, on rare occasion will you really be going into this code and manually editing it. I had the privilege today, while I was being, on a jury panel to be selected as a juror, to talk to some people that work in IT, that work out in the field as professional programmers. And, of course, we start talking shop. And the one guy is big into .NET programming. And he says he kind of regrets that he got into it so late. He didn't see the writing on the wall, but now a lot of professional work is being done with .NET. Same thing we're seeing with our employers in the area here. And what he reiterated to me is that as a .NET programmer, very rarely are you really going to be tweaking code. It's going to be little tiny tweaks that you're making, unless you're really custom coding something special and brand new. The chances are you're going to be building applications with all the libraries and pieces that already are existent. At the very beginning of the course, we built a website with Bootstrap with authentication in just moments flat, and it worked beautifully. It looked good. All you have to do is go in there and change content. And he says that's how a lot of work is really done out in the field. The thing that professional programmers do more so than the people learning is they have a bigger array of libraries that they know how to pull into their projects, and they do. And then after you build your repertoire of like what tools you use, sometimes you combine them in unique ways, sometimes you end up creating your own, and then using those over and over again. So it's really kind of a building block approach more so than anything else. The neat thing about that is it really allows for accelerated development, because out in the field, the one thing that I heard from this developer is that they want you to move quick, and they want you to be able to adapt and produce things that work well without a lot of time, right? So if you think about like how you write code when you write it manually, and sometimes you're sitting there tweaking like one line of code just to make something silly sit the right way on the screen, that mindset's got to go out the window in favor of faster productivity for the most part. For most business applications, you're not really necessarily trying to make something graphically beautiful, but you want something that the stuff's on the screen and it works, right? And there's no guessing as to what you're doing. So that's kind of the mindset. All right, so let's jump into some of this material here um, and focus on a couple of things. So the first thing the author wants us to do here is to talk about how model binding, what he's calling is a bridge between what HTTP is sending back to the server, the HTTP request, and whatever the C# code is on the back end. So you usually have a controller that intercepts, and then you run your application from there. So what they're trying to point out are some of the differences between post and get, and I hope you guys understand that little tidbit at least, right? Remember, get includes whatever data you're passing in the URL. Post obscures it, but it's still there. Okay, so there's strategies as to when and how you use those things. But what's important is when you are connecting your application to a data model, and then ultimately to actual repository of data of some sort, whether it's a flat file or a database or what have you, it's really important to have that connection where the stuff that happens in the application is actually, if you want to think of it like this, bound to the data that's in the database. So you don't want to go to a website where you've made an entry in the database where you've changed a key piece of information, let's say your address, and then you go to the website and it pulls up your old address, right? You want the application to be connected. All right, so what they'd like us to do, of course, is work with the stuff that we did in the previous chapter. So what you should do is you should bring up your Visual Studio and open up the latest version of your project. Now, what we've been working on, if you're keeping track, is this simple app. So I'm just going to open that up. And that's the one where we have the EmployeeController, if you guys remember. And then we were able to get a thing up on the screen where we could get a list of employees, ones that we hard-coded in, and then all the CRUD operations were available, if that sounds familiar. And then if you look at some of the code that pops up when I open this, hopefully that kind of rings a little bit of familiarity here. All right, so they're taking a look here, and they want us to look at the EmployeeController. So let's make sure that file is open, and that is the file that's open. And then they want us to look at the create method. And notice how this is the post version of that create method. And if you guys remember, the one thing that was kind of weird about this approach is they have a get method and a post method for each action. And the reason that it's like that is one of them is the one that just puts the form up on the screen so you can do the work, and the other one actually sends the data, right? So like if you're going to create something, so you click the create button, right? As soon as you click that, it tries to draw a screen for you that gives you all the stuff that goes with that data model, right? So in this case, an employee, and it puts that information up on the screen so you can edit it. See the difference there, right? And then when we hit the submit button after we make our change, that's the post version where it's sending the data back. That's the distinction that you guys need to definitely understand. So the method that we're looking at here is this one. And what they're trying to show us is how we go from one to the other. So let's take a look and do a little bit of a comparison. I'm trying to like kind of shrink the code down and be a little strategic with the placement of it here, so you can kind of have both on the screen at the same time, somewhat strategically. All right, and then notice that we're still missing really a piece here because there's no logic inserted for actually writing the stuff back. Okay, that's a piece we're going to start adding in. So if we ran the application and clicked create, maybe we'll get the form, but it's not actually putting it on the screen. You guys pretty clear on that? If you guys remember, that was the case. We have to actually get the code in there. And if you remember, we had to do that very action for edit, where we had to grab the stuff and throw it in there. And on top of it all, we were kind of shifting approaches as we went. And really what they're trying to demonstrate to you is kind of like an evolution of the approach and what is the better way to do it. Really, most programmers would say the best way to do it is with a database, ultimately. Whether it's created by the code or whether it pre-exists, either way. All right, so let's make sure that these things all are in alignment. So this part looks the same to me. And then what we're going to do, as the book says, is right-click on the Create action and select Add View. So we're going to add a view to create. So what we're finding out here, frankly, is that you can't do the create because there's no interface for it yet. So what we're doing by right-clicking in this section is creating that interface. So if you go ahead and do the right-click, Add View, you'll come up with this dialog box. And then I want you to notice that there is a difference between what we're getting up on the screen with version 2017 and what is listed in the book. And hopefully you guys aren't freaking out to this when you see that the screens are a little bit different. And really what you should try to do is progress forward anyhow. Just because they change the screen a little bit doesn't mean that there's something wrong. So we do see that the view name is called Create. We do see that the model class, well, that's not even specified. But here in the document, now where did my document go? There it is. See, the template will be based upon Create. Now notice that's a given. It's just in there, right? So we're just pulling it up from a list. And then the model class, which one would you figure? The one that we created? The employee one? Yeah, that's the one that we're pulling in. The other thing that's shown in the document is that those checkboxes at the bottom are left unchecked. Once again, if you were using master pages or layout pages, you would pull those in by simply clicking the box and pointing to a file. That's not the case here. The other thing that might happen is that we might have the need to bring what we're creating right now in as a piece to just put on another page. So that's why we have the checkbox for create as a partial view. So just imagine the scenario. If we had a whole infrastructure built, you know, menus, sidebars, all this content, and then you had a little section of the page that's showing like what's in your employee database, and you click create, we might create it as a partial view if that's only going to be a component on the page as opposed to being the whole page. So you see the difference there. All right, so those are the choices they'd like us to make. Go ahead and click Add. And it's doing its scaffolding. All right, then that will create this CSHTML file. And this will include some pretty key components. The first thing that we want to notice is at the top that we do have our model being discovered. Did you guys see what just happened on the screen as I was pointing to it? Did you guys notice that it started out underlined, and then it took a little bit. And I'm running a reasonably fast machine. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that as these applications, you start adding pieces to them. Sometimes it takes a little while for things to build out and to recognize in the IntelliSense and the on-the-fly debugger to recognize those connections. So it took a minute, you know, and the first inclination, of course, is you see it red and you go right to it and try to fix it, right? There's a little bit of a virtue in waiting a few seconds because the errors went away, which is a wonderful thing. So you see the model declaration at the top. You also see that we're not using a layout. And then you're seeing, as a result, an entire HTML structure here. Notice all the razor directives in there with all the little HTML helpers that are thrown in. And those you can read about in Chapter 5. And a lot of those helpers really are built to help us work with forms. Forms are still kind of deemed like the #1 way to interact within an application, especially when you're using text or data. All right. Now, we have, by virtue of that simple right-click and the scaffolding, we have created a page that is a form that will collect all the data that is related to our data model for this application. So it looks at the employee data structure and created a form for us in which we can put in all our stuff. So if you were to scroll through this content and you look at, try to reason through where the actual form is and what the fields are, you'll notice some of the things that are familiar. So for example, there's a name field, there's a joining date and age, right? So you guys are kind of recognizing those things. And yes, there's a lot of code there, but really what's happening is it's automatically creating these structures. And notice that it not only creates the structure, but it also drops in validation, you guys. That's pretty huge. So if it's asking for age, it is intelligently realizing it's an integer for age, and it puts in validation to make sure that it's not like a string, right? So you don't want like somebody typing their name into the age field. It kind of prevents that from happening. Same is true for a name. You probably don't want like a floating point number in there or something to that effect, but I think you get the point. All right, the next thing that we need to do is we need to create the code in the employee controller that will actually fill the spot here that I highlighted, so that when you click the submit button on the form and you are posting your data, right, you're posting it back to the server, then you'll have some sort of like logic that runs. And that's the part that we're going to see now on the top of page 108. That's the code that we're shooting for. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab that code and drop it into this spot. Now what I recommend that you do is you just grab the whole block of code, and I have the PDF on my second screen here, so you can actually see it. And I'm realizing that I copied the last line too, so I'm going to replace everything inside there, and then I'm just going to paste it in. Now the paste isn't really that clean. I got a lot of stuff that is ending up on the same line, so I'm trying to clean that up really quick. And then let's get that in place, and then let's take a look at how it's structured. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to format it just like what I see in the tutorial document, so at least you have, apples to apples when you're doing a comparison. And then I notice that this needs its own line. All right, so remember, this is when you hit submit and hypothetically you've changed or you've entered information in to create a new entry for your application, so for new data entry. The first thing that we do is we set up basically the employee class, which is pulling in the data from the data model. Okay, so that is, the model component that we see there. It's the model that we're pulling in here. That employee model is the one that's defined in the application. And where is that defined? That's defined right here. Okay, so we're kind of instantiating it on the fly is what's happening. Now in terms of the rest of this, once we have the object set up to be able to basically represent the data structure, okay, so that what we instantiated here contains all the fields that we see here, right? So imagine, sure. Yep, and if you need to look at any of the code, just shout out like that, and I can put it up on the screen. Are you seeing a difference between my code and your code?
No, I'm seeing a lot of errors.
Sounds like a personal problem.
Yeah.
All right, so once we have that data instantiated as an object waiting to receive that data, an empty object, empty employee object, we then start to fill in all the fields. So like we know that there's a name, the date that they joined, and their age. And this next few lines of code are just basically taking the data from the form and putting them, taking the data and putting it into a form that the database can work with. So for example, notice that they have like a little command here, try parse. And what that does is it tries to parse the data to make sure that it fits into the correct format that we need. And if you guys know how date times work, it can be a combination of, year, month, day, times all combined together as one object. So that's why they do a try-parse on it. Once they figure that out, they do take that date and put it into the joining date. So it takes a little bit of conversion before it goes in. So just because you type something in a form doesn't necessarily mean that it comes back nicely. The other thing that happens is that when you see this this JDate thing or the date time thing, you're going to notice that when we run the form's going to automatically generate a little calendar that you can click on and scroll through and click on the date so you don't have to type it in manually. And that's all done automatically. Then you'll also notice that age is being collected and then stored into the object. Once that stuff is all gathered together and stored into variables, because that's really what this is at this point, then we go ahead and put in the add command, which then actually writes that object back to the database or the data structure. Maybe it's a better way to think about it right now. When you're all done, then you're sent back to the index page. That's what we've decided here. And you could take them anywhere, including back to the same page if you so wished. Just depends on what your application design is. All right, then let's move on. And really the next step at this point is to actually try this. So we're going to run the application. You should save this employee controller. And then once you launch the application, we want to go to the employee URL. So you want to append employee to it. And this time, with any luck, I'm waiting for my browser window to pop up. And it always jumps on the second screen for whatever reason. Once this pops up and we go to the employee page with a list of the employees, we should be able to click Create New. And then we should have a form created that will help us do our work. All right, so of course that error is actually anticipated. And I'm going to type in employee with a capital E. That's really technically what we're supposed to do. And there's our list. Now go ahead and click Create New. And where we did not have this in the past, now all of a sudden we have a form that's built for us to interact. Now the question I ask you, and thinking back to like what this programmer guy I was talking to today was saying, did we really code any of this? What part did we really code? The stuff that was in the book that showed us how to put everything into the database, right? And that, frankly, that's probably the trickiest part. But you know what? There's even automation scripts for doing that stuff. So in this case, let's type some stuff in. So if you want to put your own name in there. And then I'm noticing that I'm not getting the calendar thing like I thought I would, but maybe I'm not thinking about it clearly. And of course, 29 forever, and click Create. Now you notice after you click Create, it does take you back to where we started. And the information that I entered is present. I am noticing, though, that the date's not correct. Did you guys have the same effect? Okay, and I think I ran into this the last time we did this, so that'll be one of our challenges here is to figure out how to fix that. Yeah, if you notice, actually, top of page 111, the way the date came through is the way it's supposed to come through. In fact, their example shows it too. Okay, so now if you take a look now at the bottom of page 111, they're telling us that we need to change the parameter of the create method to accept the employee model object rather than the form collection that we've been working with. So we had this different structure in place. And you can think of it really kind of as an array of arrays is how I would look at that particular object in this case. And what we need to change that to, so we're looking at basically the parameter that's being passed. We need to change that to employee, which is our model, and then the object that we're working with currently. So we're just changing the create method. Notice that the other thing that they're doing is they're taking all of this code out. You guys noticing that? And they're just leaving this line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually comment this out rather than delete it. And I'm just going to use the CSS style comment because I just find it quickest in this situation. So make the same change. All right. And there's another thing that they would like us to tweak. So this is one change we need to make. So now we need to go and make sure that the field on the page for create, so the create CS HTML file has a little bit of an edit. We want to make sure that this is in place too. So what we're looking for is one that's called HTML editor for. And what's it for? The model.name. And I just happen to be looking at it right there. It's right at the bottom of the page. So this is the entry that they want you to go after, I believe. And I'm double checking that it was actually the second one. So HTML editor for model, model name, HTML attributes, new class, form control. That's the one. So what this is going to do is this is going to pull in that stuff from the model directly. So it seems like we don't have to make any tweaks here. Let's go ahead and actually run this and see if we can now get it to behave. All right, pulling it back over from screen number 2. All right, now for whatever reason it went right to create, and that was actually relative to where I launched it from. And are you guys noticing something weird? Where's my entry that I just put in there? So what happened before is because we were using that collection, it was only instantiating in memory, and it was not sticking the data back to where it was. So watch what happens now when we click Create New. See if there's a difference. In fact, let's put the same data in there. And I'm just going to type 29 in. I'm going to click Create. And notice now it did take the information. Did everybody's work? Okay. I'm hoping there's there's nodding going on in the classroom. And if not, please let me know and I will come and take a look. Yeah, Tom is noticing here in class that, well, everybody's date is now the same. That's a little problematic too. Could that be because of the way that we're pulling in the data for these other people? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, what you could do is you could go back and try to figure out, didn't we have that data hard-coded somewhere? Do you guys remember? And do you remember what the command was that we put in place? Do you see like what's in the code? And it says, you know, so for Carson, for Alan, looks like we got Carson in there twice, whatever. Do we have Carson in there twice? Sure enough. That the date, it's just time stamped today, right now. It's converted to a string and put in there. So that's not a mistake. So I guess, you know, one way that you could test it is you could create new and put in a different date altogether. So let's experiment and try that. Let's, you know, put in a date from last year. Just making one up. I don't know how old Aaron Rodgers is, maybe like 35, 36, something like that. Pretty much an old man. All right, but then you do see that this one where I did like manually set the date. So these dates being 10/16 are just coincidental with this one, simply because, you know, I wasn't thinking about that before I typed that one in. I just figured, put today's date in, right? But really, that was created by the code that we had in place. So the application is doing that automatically. Yes, we forced that data in. Yes, it's choosing today's date. We told it to choose today's date. All right, folks. Um, Tom is noticing something else, that if we create new and we don't put anything in, right? This is what you did. Yeah, so it does. So really what it was doing before, it was defaulting to the default date, which apparently is a couple thousand years ago. And this seems like a good record for me to delete. But you know, are you noticing? And you guys maybe didn't even try this, right? Yeah, can't delete it because we haven't written the action for delete yet. Now, the question I have for you is, why do they leave the methods for doing the data interactions open? And the answer that hopefully your brain will find is, it depends on how we're connecting to our data. So they don't know. We can imply a data structure with a class file, but that doesn't mean it's in a database. That doesn't mean it's in a text file. That's a separate piece. And that's kind of where we're going next, as you can tell by the title of the next section. So I'm actually going to pause the video here. All right, magically up on the screen now is section 15 in the tutorial document. Yeah, because I just moved it onto the screen just now, and they don't see that because I actually hit pause. But you can see the next tidbit here is databases. And I want you guys to understand here that we're doing a slow build, right? We're doing a slow build from a building class, feeding data directly into the application in the form of a list, and then in the form of a collection, and then in the form of a model. So we're actually using a class to build a model. That was the last chapter. And now we're going to tie it into a database. Now, the interesting thing here is that there's a tool that's built in to .NET. And it's not just for MVC applications, mind you. This is for all of the .NET framework. Is this thing called Entity Framework. And the Entity Framework is really, I want to say that, you know, it's an abstraction layer, but that's not really what it is, because, you know, last night I was teaching Ruby on Rails, and if those of you that have taken that class, if you guys remember when we worked with Active Record with that technology, and you guys are all shaking your heads, that's an abstraction layer where we have commands that you run that look nothing like SQL, but do SQL actions in the background. Entity Framework is kind of Microsoft's similar type of tool. And really the intent of it is that you don't have to sit there and write SQL code and intersperse it into your application. That's not the objective. They don't want you doing that, right? And when you take like a PHP class, you learn the painstaking approach of like interspersing your HTML, your PHP, your SQL, and God forbid you forget a quote or a semicolon or something, and all your code falls apart, right? The intent here is to kind of like obscure some of that from you. And you notice that third paragraph, the first sentence, that the entity framework does support the code first approach. So what that means to us, unlike a lot of the other coding technologies that you've learned where we go through the process of either write code to create the database, or go to a prompt or some database tool, build a database, connect to it, and then start feeding data back and forth. In this case, we can still use that model like this that implies a table structure for a database. And not only that, but you can add more of these with ties between them. And then the entity framework that they're speaking of in the tutorial document steps in, builds the tables, builds the connections, and writes the code for the interaction on top of it all. So What a wonderful thing it is. It really is. It's very powerful. Um, but we need to do a little bit of work before we begin. So we are going to be working on the same application. So we're going to be picking up right here. So the first step is going to be to install the entity framework in your project. So the implication there is, of course, is that it doesn't just come with, like jQuery or something or whatever. You have to add that tool into the mix. So let me pull this off to the second screen and start doing some of these actions here. All right, so what they're having us do is run the NuGet package manager to do this action. Now, what they're showing in the book is they actually want you to go to like the tools, find the package manager, and then go ahead and pull it in. And yes, you can do it exactly that way. You can also do a right click on your project and pull in NuGet packages this way as well. And that's usually the way I do it. With Visual Studio, I've gotten to the point where I really don't look in the menus unless I lose something and need to reset the workspace. I tend to do most things with a right click. And I don't know if you guys work the same way. And I know everybody's got their own pattern, so no judgment on that. But I'm just telling you the way that I do it and find successful. So go ahead and do that. Bring that up. And then you'll get the interface here in which we want to start looking for the entity framework. So just come up to the search box and type entity, and you're going to see it says no packages found. Why? Because right now it's just looking at what's installed, not what's actually present. So what we want to do is actually make sure we click on browse here. And then you'll see the entity framework, very common tool. Select that. My suggestion is, in terms of version, to go with whatever is the latest stable version. I'm noticing that in the book, they were using 6.1.2, so this is just a couple versions older. So we're just going to go with 6.2. That should be fine. And then once you have that selected, all you really need to do is click install. But before you click install, I just want you to take right, of course. If you already clicked it, you're okay. Freak out not. I just want to point out, like on the left-hand side, there are some of the other things that you can actually pull in. So notice that Entity Framework does have a version that works with the compact version of SQL Server, the light version, so to speak. And then there's also the ability to pull MySQL in or Oracle stuff in. So you can connect with lots of different types of databases. It doesn't have to just be Microsoft products. So that's there. All right, click install, let it do its work. Of course, you will say, okay. Of course, you have to accept the license, not much choice. And then you're seeing, if you're watching my screen here, you'll see all the stuff on the right side of the screen start to pull in a bunch of tools. It dropped a bunch of stuff into the references folder. It expanded momentarily and collapsed back down. I didn't make that happen. It did it all by itself. And then, of course, I'm going to expand the output window here to just make sure that there's no errors or output problems from installing the package. And now that it is installed, now you can come into the same framework and uninstall it if you wish, if you don't want to try to hunt down the files manually. And you know what, folks? You don't want to do that. If you're adding a package like this with the package manager, use the package manager to uninstall it. Because you have no clue where it's putting stuff. It brings in lots of DLL files, lots of libraries and whatnot to make this all happen. Just like in any other language, really. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this interface here. So I'm just going to close that tab. And then hopefully everything went in okay. Nobody had any issues installing it, I'm assuming? Okay, no nods, that's good. All right, next thing that we need to do, according to the book, is on the bottom of page 118, we're going to add what they call database context. So we need to basically set up kind of like the framework in which the database is going to operate here correctly. All right, so we need to create a little bit more than what we have here. So what we currently have is just a definition of the columns that go into the table. But now we need to basically add a little component to the end of this class file here. In fact, we're going to add another class actually directly inside of this class. And this will be a public class. And I'm actually typing this one in manually. I hope you don't mind. And this one is the database context being defined. And that extends a pre-existing superclass, of course, called DB context, where we're going to pull all our tools in from. We're going to add our curly brackets. And then inside there, we're going to create a method called employee DB context that intelligently finds it, of course. And then another set of curly brackets. Following that block of code, but still inside the employee DB context, we are going to create a little array list here. And inside of it, we are going to put the employee object. Oops, and I meant to put a bracket in there, so I apologize. And see how it finds the object. When you're doing it the correct way, it really tries to help you code it out. And this will be called employees. And notice the use of the plural here. And then on top of it, we want to make sure that we have getters and, of course, setters, like so. And I love that about C#, how easy that is to accomplish. Now, I'm getting some underlines here, and I'm thinking it's because I'm missing some sort of a library. In fact, if I hover, oh, that one's not very helpful. Well, maybe this one will give me some sort of potential fix. And what you're going to see here is the very first suggestion, at least on mine. It says using system data entity, and guess what? Yes, we want to use that library. So this is the piece that we're adding that allows it to basically understand that we're using entity framework in this class file. And hopefully that's clear for you. Yeah, so if you need to look at the code, yes, I can scroll down and try to get that all on screen. Now I'm also noticing I still have an underline. Are you guys having the same underline? Okay, so I got some yeses and some nos. Well, one thing you should always check is to make sure that we're doing it just like the book's doing it. I suppose that's one thing to check. And then I'm checking my naming. And that looks okay. All my naming seems fine. All right, so let's hover over that one. Yep, you caught it. All right, so that's correct. When I type this in, see where my cursor is right now? I'm trying to extend itself. Yeah, that doesn't really work too well. I'm extending this main library, and actually this should be a lowercase b, not an uppercase b. And there we go. Now the error is fixed. So as I was typing that, I don't know if IntelliSense and changed it. I'm guessing that's probably what happened, because I could have swore I typed it correctly, right? See, and with Visual Studio, you can say that. I know I typed it right. IntelliSense changed my answer for me. All right, so if you have no underlines, then you should be okay, and I would suggest doing a Control-S to save. And really what you're seeing on screen now is the entirety of the revised employee model class. Okay, with this next bit, I want to show you this part. I'm bringing the document back over because I think this is pretty important. And you guys have worked at, at this point, at least with, in my mind, 2 languages, if not 3 languages, where you've done database connections with connection strings. So my first thought is you did PHP and MySQL, probably, right? And then you probably did, or are doing right now, perhaps, if you're taking Java 2, you're probably doing a Java connection to either a MySQL database or a SQL Server database. I don't know what your instructor is making you do. I would assume it's MySQL, though, most likely. Now, whenever you're working with a database connection in a traditional application, you would, if the database was kind of an already existing entity, you would have a connection string built into your application that you could call upon whenever you needed it. And in the .NET environment, there's no reason that you wouldn't do that, aside from the fact that we're not. But in this case, if we did have a pre-existing database, we wanted to connect, we would write that into the web config file. And I want you to notice that the highlight right below the box says you don't actually need to add it, so don't add it. Because the intention, when I first went through the document, is I typed it in. I'm like, hey, what's going on here? It's not working, right? And then we actually read what it said. So that's what happens when you actually read. What they're showing you is an example. So if we did have that database existing, either as a file or as a connection to an external system, you would need that connection string in your application, just like you do in these other languages, to make sure that you can connect to the darn thing first, right? Because every database takes parameters in different ways and looks for different strings of text to get the connection going, basically to log you in and allow you to do the work. Okay, so this language is no exception. There's an example inside the box of what one might look like if you were actually doing it. We are not. What we're going to do is the bottom highlight, which says that we're going to create this next little piece here to do that work for us. So I'm moving the document back over. So we're at the bottom of page 119, going on to page 120. All right. So it does say at the very bottom of 119, if you read what it says exactly this. First, we add, and this is how it's written, so it's not me misspeaking. It says, first we add create a private EmployeeDB context class. So are you guys reading what that means? No, because it's not written well. Okay. But we are going to add a private object, and then we're going to update all the methods that we've already worked on. So we're going to update index, we're going to update edit, we're going to update create, because if we don't, then it's not going to work with the new structure. So we're transitioning here from working with a model in memory to something that's going to get written into a database. And that's why the changes are necessary. So the first thing we need to do is go to the employee controller. So bring that file up on your screen. And then I'm kind of like side by side scrolling on my screen here. So first I'm looking at the index method, but I'm noticing that right inside the declaration for the first public class, there's a line of code. And I'm trying to get my cursor to select this in my PDF, and it's being a little resistant right now. And we need to add just a tad bit of code right here at the very top of this class. So this is the part where we are actually putting together this private object, which is going to be the database. And we're naming it as such. It's instantiating the database connection here. Inside the index method, we're going to make a couple of tweaks, and they're pretty minor. The first tweak is going to be this. So instead of using the employee list, now we're going to be pulling in the database dot employee like so. Nope, not like so. I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong line of code. Employees. Where is it pulling this from, you guys? Well, if you look down here, this is where it's pulling it from. Okay. The rest of the code in the index method, we're still going to order by ID, we're still going to select, and we're still going to return a view. So that stuff's not going to change. If you scroll down to the create method, the get version will stay unchanged. Where we made changes was in the post version. And remember, I had commented all this stuff out, and now I'm actually going to go ahead and delete it because I see that we're not going to need it. And in its place, we are now going to call that database connection. We are going to call in the plural version of employees and see how it's auto-recognizing it. And then we're going to do add, and what are we adding? The employee object. Put a semicolon at the end. And then instead of doing this command to write the changes back, we're going to use the database version of it, which we call in our object, and then we run the save changes method, and that does the work for us. So that one command now replaces all that stuff that we saw there. And what it's doing is it's pulling in the whole thing as an object as opposed to all the little pieces that we were coding in. I want you also to notice how some stuff was underlining, and then as I was typing through, it kind of went away, right? So don't get overeager to fix the underlines. Let the engine recognize what's going on first. Scrolling down, now we're going to work on the edit section. All right, so in the get section, I'm noticing some differences here. So previously when we're pulling in that list, it was pulling it in as a list. So that's going to actually go away now. So this piece is now gone. In fact, if you're not comfortable with that, just comment it out. The next line will remain partially unchanged. So in this spot here, I'm going to call in the database. I'm going to call in the employees. And we're still running the single method, and none of the syntax inside here will change. So this is the revised version here. If you're following along in the book, we're at the top of page 121. So as I'm speaking to you, I'm kind of carefully looking between both screens and trying to make sure I'm not messing up anything I'm typing in. I think that's pretty important, and you should do the same. And if you catch me typing something in incorrectly, please let me know. All right, now let's go to the post part of edit. So we're in the post section. Not a bad time to do this, actually, in your controller file. And then I'm just checking really quick. The parameters passed in are fine. Checking the try, and I'm noticing here in the try that once again we're going to make that same edit. So we're going to do DB employees. The single stays just the way it is. Then inside the if statement, where we're going to put our database code, we're going to just add a line. So we're going to say database, and if you're posting back, what's it going to do? Well, it's going to save the changes. So we'll call the save changes method. It looks like one too many parens in there. So that part looks fine. And then I'm not seeing any additional changes that are needed in this file. Now, one thing I am seeing, though, is they no longer are Well, you know, I guess I shouldn't count on that being the case, but it looks to me like the file is ending right after this edit, where we have all this other stuff in here. I'm not ready to get rid of this other stuff yet. Some of the stuff we're still building. Now, it's not telling us at this point that we should get rid of all the stuff, but I can tell from what's happening on page 122. So when you run the application, all of a sudden it's supposed to look like this, right? Which means it's not pulling in the pre-created data, correct? Okay, so here's what I'm going to do temporarily. Well, let's move that off to the other screen. I'm going to go ahead and actually comment out the stuff at the bottom. So from here, oops, I'm going to put in some CSS style comments, and then I'm going to comment out everything I think up to here is where I want to go. And then we'll see if that's correct. It seems to be correct, so I'm going to go ahead and save it. I am noticing that delete is present in my file while it is not present in the book, but I'm not really worried about that one as much. Let's go ahead and run this. Make sure your work is saved. Cross your fingers, right? It's kind of how it goes sometimes because you want it to work. Get that browser over here. And they want us to go to the employee URL, so we'll let it kind of load the application first. It seems to be taking a little bit longer than last time, right? Right. The error is expected because we have nothing in the root. Go ahead and press enter with the employee appended. All right. Now this is pretty uneventful to do what we just did to end up with that. But believe it or not, the fact that it even came up on the screen is actually a good sign. It did take longer for this to come up, and there's a reason for it taking longer. So what we need to do now is we need to, in our Visual Studio, and I would recommend, I mean, you could stop the application from running. In fact, that might be the wiser choice. In fact, why don't we do that? Let's go ahead and close the application from running. And then they want us to bring up a tool called the SQL Server Object Explorer. And if you look in your view menu, that's one spot where you can find it. In fact, there's a good example of me preferring to use the menu in this circumstance, so go ahead and click on that. It's going to take a moment to pull it up. And then I want you to take a look here at what we are working with. Notice, and I don't know if you guys noticed what just happened up on the screen, but it pulled in some objects here. One popped up right away, and the other one took a little bit. Notice how the projects are named, but then notice below it, well, there's nothing in there. Well, maybe, just maybe, that's not where it's found. In fact, you need to actually expand some of these entries here to be able to find. Well, this doesn't seem like the right spot either. Maybe it's this first one. So expand databases, and you can follow along in the book and see here is where we actually find it. So notice how I went to this version of the listing. So it says local DB, MS SQL, local DB, SQL Server. And so what it's telling you is we're creating a database locally within the application. Okay. I don't know about you guys, but on my machine here, I haven't installed like the full-blown version of SQL Server on my laptop. Just whatever's come with Visual Studio. That's actually a conscious thought on my part because SQL Server running in the background all the time really kind of robs a lot of system resources. It's a pretty big program. Now, if you get that far and you can actually find the listing for your application, so you can see it's named MVC Simple App Models Employee DB Context. And then you can go ahead and expand that. And then the stuff that you see inside here is very similar to what you would see in SQL Server Management Studio in terms of structure. Probably the first place to go to is to look at the tables, because really we created one class file called employee.cs, and then notice that we now have a database table called employees. We can pull the columns up. And are you guys noticing this? This is really kind of interesting because it not only created the columns, it set the data types as well. If you guys remember your database stuff, so it made name of our car and joining date, the date time, and age, integer. It also has an ID field, right? Well, we did add an ID field, and it automatically made it a primary key. That's pretty interesting. And it's not allowed for it to be null as a primary key, which is what you want for a primary key. Should always have something in it. Otherwise, it's not really going to work that well. All right. Now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually take a look inside the table. So what I'm doing here is notice I right-clicked on the table, and then from that menu, there's actually a little box that says View Data. So click that. And then notice, right now, there's nothing in the database. Correct? If you double-click that table, like I just did, and I think the book does it in reverse order here, and I apologize for that. By double-clicking on the table definition itself, notice that it shows you the structure of the table. It shows you key information, and even cooler yet, look at the very bottom of the screen. It shows you the SQL code too. And really, keep in mind that even though we're using Entity Framework to do all this for us automatically, and the only thing that we really did is we created a class file, we told it to use Entity Framework, and then we put a little bit of code in our application, and it built this out automatically. The stuff that's happening on the back end, folks, is all handled by Entity Framework. It does the SQL stuff for us. Because ultimately, that's the language the database uses anyhow. They're just obscuring it from us. All right? So you can view the data, which currently is empty. Right? You can view the structure. In fact, you could change the structure. And if you want, go ahead and relaunch the application. And you know, truth be told, we probably could have left it running the whole time. So we'll let the application come up. We'll go to the employee page. We're going to go ahead and create new. And I don't know, what name do we put in here now? Something goofy. Some date in the future. Some future Christmas. right? So I added Darth Vader to my application. If you come back to Visual Studio now, go to Data, right? Well, I don't see it, but you notice how there's a little refresh button right there? And there's my entry. So we're seeing that what's happening in the browser is now actually writing to a database table. And you guys, this is a really big step, you know, in the application build is this ability right here. All right, so you're seeing that we've got this to work. I don't know if everybody in class was equally as successful, but we're going to help them get there. And if you want to try that a few times, go ahead and add a couple of entries just to make sure that it's working. Oh, and doesn't like my entry there. But you see how the validation kicked in automatically? I didn't create that. Just built in. Come back to the database. Did it change? It sure did. The other thing I'm going to try doing before I quit is I'm also going to go in here and do an edit because we did change that, right? And what I'll do is I'll change Luke's age to 28. And then let's refresh. And the changed here as well. So if you can get it to do these things, you're good. Now keep in mind that we have not done delete yet. So delete's not going to work. But you should be able to create, you should be able to edit, you should be able to see it in the database. I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here, and we're going to spend the rest of the time in class trying to make sure everybody's works.